When Seth asked me to talk about business decisions based on sentiment, I thought, no problem. I've been doing social media for about 8 years after having studied social psychology for a long time. And I thought, I've got tons of clients. I've been either delivering research or strategy, all based on social media. And I know tons of people who are making business decisions based on sentiment. So I started calling them. And as quickly as I started trying to gather case studies and calling clients, I started losing confidence. Because as eager as they were to talk about sentiment and business decisions based on sentiment, they had all sorts of reasons as to why they weren't doing it. So I thought, okay, if you can't do it or you're not doing it, I'll change my hypothesis. I can change the story. We can still talk about business decisions based on sentiment, just giving, examples of why you can't. And people got a little bit nervous, and they didn't really want to talk about how they weren't doing it because they were so excited. They're social media evangelists, they're social business passionistas, and they really wanted to give me information. And so I had this sort of mixed story and was in this kind of mixed place about how am I going to tell a good story about this with some impact. And so I went to the gym. And I was reading Scientific American, not this article here, but I was reading an op-ed piece sort of criticizing an article that came out saying that genes are linked to political behavior and that there was a liberal-leaning gene, and that's why we see this kind of divide, that there's a gene for being liberal, there's a gene for being conservative. And I thought, wow, that's just like sentiment. We have this need to paint this simple story and say business decisions are based on sentiment. Complex behaviors like voting are based on genes. I thought, well, there it is. So I started reading about, what really is the relationship between genes and these complex behaviors. And you see all sorts of examples of this. We're always trying to make sense of these really complicated things like business decisions and base them on this very simple story. A gene that makes you lean to the left, a gene for sexual orientation, a gene for religiosity, a gene for obesity. It's the same thing with sentiment. We yearn for this in business. We want to tell these stories. These were the stories that I was asking my clients for, almost literally. Tell me about that time where you started retargeting and looking for different consumers because you were seeing negative sentiment and you had to start talking to dads instead of moms or teens instead of adults. Tell me about that time when you relaunched New Coke and then, brought back the old recipe because of the sentiment situation. Or tell me about that time when things were just really blah and you were sick of seeing this huge column of neutral sentiment and you really wanted to see some emotion there. But again, nobody had these stories. And so I got to this idea that sentiment is like DNA. Some of you may have been at South by Southwest a few years ago and heard Charlene Lee talk about social media being like air. Well, here you have the new meme, sentiment is like DNA. You heard it here first. Everyone wants to link genes to complex behavior, but usually in genetics, to oversimplify the story, it's a polymorphism. So it's this repeated pattern that we see showing up in hundreds of thousands of cases, but it's a whole combination. It's not one gene. It's more of a combination. It's more of a situation. And it's combined with environmental factors. So it's not all genetics. It has a little bit to do with the surrounding environment. And then together, this sometimes explains behavior. So it's not a sure thing, but like genes, sentiment only rarely causes a given behavior, and thus rarely leads to a business decision. Now, throughout this keynote, I'm going to sort of break down this story and tell you how sentiment is like DNA and try to make a case that that's the situation that we're in. And I'll use examples, I don't know whether they're case studies or anecdotes from business, as well as a few ideas from academia to try to paint this picture. And throughout, I want to try to identify some of the boundary conditions as to when we can and when we cannot make business decisions based on sentiment. And lastly, although I hope you don't think this is a cop-out, I really want to encourage data immersion over these ideas of sentiment being the silver bullet on which you can make business decisions, and encourage you, whether you're a strategist or a vendor, to encourage yourselves or encourage you to make it easy for others to be more immersed in the data, because I think that is the key. So chapter 1, as the story unfolds. The promise came out, let's say, 2004, 2005, and increasingly so over the past few years, that sentiment was a silver bullet. It was going to make surveys redundant. It was going to be this beautiful barometer for public perception, a really simple metric that you could just put your finger on. You could get a percentage and say, what is everybody thinking and feeling, and then act on it. And it was promised to be the most actionable. So if you think about the other type of data and metrics that we have available from social media analysis or from listening, as we call it today, we've got topics, we've got buzz volume, sometimes we have things like reach, but sentiment is just the most favorable. It seems the most actionable, and it's related to similar concepts from investing, where a sentiment metrics tells us to go or not go, to be bullish or bearish. And so this idea is very attractive. And it's also seemingly more contextualized. So whereas we talk about buzz volume in these data sets that really vary by the platform that you use and really vary with respect to what we have access to by way of our harvesting mechanisms, that's really hard to understand. Whereas sentiment as a proportion of the data set, one that you can see across different samples, across different brands, products, issues, it's just easier to digest in our brain. So for all of these reasons, it seemed so easy. And where we are now is that sentiment is being added to the marketing dashboards as a KPI. It seems like we're in sort of a good place. Clients are always asking, what should I put as my sentiment benchmark? How do I get it up there? I want my executives to see what we're doing in social. So how can we have sentiment be a KPI? And I would think that you would all agree with me. We see this more and more, that sentiment is being taken more seriously now as social media comes into the presence of all the executives. This is usually happening by social enthusiasts. I think one of the things that we see happening in the industry today is that it's one social evangelist who's really trying to encourage their business to be social, to be a social business. And so they're taking this metric and putting it on the dashboard as somewhat of a badge of honor and somewhat of a, come on, let's let this be the gateway to social. Let's put social on the map. Let's get it on everybody's radar. And what's funny to me, almost paradoxical, is that the biggest attack, the thing that I hear most, is a criticism of the methodology. So it's not about how business decisions based on sentiment ended up being bad. It's that they can't do them because the methodology isn't precise enough. And so what do? We end up tweaking the methodology. In some cases, some of you and others have ended up innovating and moving beyond sentiment and talking about emotion instead of positive or negative affect or mood. But for the most part, with methodology criticized, the only thing that we can do is try to better it, make it more accurate. Here's a quote from one of my clients when I called and asked her if she would be willing to give me a good example of a business decision based on sentiment. She says, I'll be very candid and say that we haven't utilized formal sentiment analysis to make business decisions. The key contributing factor is that we haven't had the time or resources to fine-tune our tools to reflect what I think is close enough to true sentiment. So she goes on to say that she thinks it requires a lot of initial and ongoing work to make the tools have an accurate reflection of true sentiment. And I find that paradoxical. You can gloss over this and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I hear that a lot. But it doesn't. Because what are we trying to relate sentiment to? It seems like it's an okay place. It seems like we're making progress. But I don't think that we should fool ourselves. Let me review where we are so far as I talk through this idea of sentiment as DNA. So we know that in genes, a polymorphism or repeated pattern of DNA predicts complex behavior. This too is true in sentiment. It's a pattern over time. It's a pattern in conjunction with other variables like volumes or segmented analysis or topics or drivers. It's usually a combination. And it's combined with environmental factors. In the business environment, things like the culture of the organization, the processes that exist for disseminating information, and the overall acceptance and investment in social become critical to taking sentiment seriously enough to make business decisions based on it. And then lastly, it helps explain behavior. As I said earlier, sentiment alone rarely causes a given behavior, and this is where I want to focus. We've made this leap to say we can make a business decision based on sentiment, but we haven't thought about what's in the middle. Why do we want to do that? Because sentiment should predict behaviors on which our business decisions are based. Those behaviors being the complex ones about purchase intention, basket size increases, more frequent store visits, more product loyalty. Those behaviors, that's the missing link. Let me remind you that purchase decisions and these types of behaviors that I'm talking about, the decision to purchase and buy something, are very complex behaviors, just like voting in the example that I presented earlier. So let's break this down. Here are some of the anecdotes and case studies that I have. In each of them, I want to represent each of these ideas. So in the first case, with Alienware, a Dell subsidiary, I want to talk about sentiment as a polymorphism. In the second case, I want to emphasize the importance of the business environment. As you can see there, Rosie the Reveler, or a social evangelist who's standing behind her sentiment report. And then in the last example, I want to present a little bit of evidence from academia about this relationship between sentiment and behaviors, and what we know and what we don't know. So this first example, sentiment as a polymorphism. So this is a great example because Dell has invested heavily in social media, and what you see here is really the whole story, that it takes sentiment, a number of other factors, as well as the business environment to make a business decision. I really like this case study because Dell monitors about 27,000 mentions a day. And they have a team and they have a command center, and they've been very vocal about what they're doing in social media. So Alienware, as some of you know, is sort of an uber-passionate gamer product. It's hardware that's for the very prestigious gamers. It has some fancy lighting in it. It's really a very prestigious and heavy piece of hardware that gamers are really passionate about and talk about throughout the day. And upon release of this new hardware product, the gamers started being really negative, and they started complaining about overheating. And so the social media team listened to this, and they brought it to Singapore, and they said, can you guys take a look at this? You know, this really important segment is talking about our product in a really negative way. And note, amidst 27,000 comments in one day, they were paying attention to this. The engineers said, we can't replicate the problem, it must be a fluke. They went back to the gamers, they said, we're trying to handle this. Typically, they use the channel for a little bit of marketing communications, mostly for sort of customer service and occasionally R&D. And this would end up being the exception where it really became an R&D issue. So they went back to the gamers, and the gamers said, look, here's a video of me using my computer and see how it's overheating. You can really get a sense of what's going on here. And they had a ton of back and forth there. They ended up taking the videos and showing them to the engineers. And the engineers, without even listening to what was going on, noticed something peculiar in the videos. When a gamer uses a new piece of hardware, they fold down the laptop and they have an enormous monitor so that they can see the game at large and use the power of the computer underneath. Well, instead of breaking Seth's computer, you can imagine when you fold over the screen of your laptop, it's going to block the exhaust fan. And so they were blocking the fan, and the heat couldn't get out, and so therefore it was overheating. So it was an idiosyncrasy of this passionate user more than a fluke in the product. The engineers never would have found this otherwise, never would have cared about it, but they made a business decision to change the hardware and adhere and cater to what the gamers wanted. So here you have the situation that I just talked through, but again, the business decision was this hardware fix. They built a new chassis, And they would have never detected this via testing. They would have never built it in that way without having known about this. So the winning mix here was not just a simple sentiment score. We see that it's trending up, or we see that positive is trending down, but instead it was this winning mix where it was a very segmented analysis. It was a very trained team listening and knowing how to find a needle in that haystack of 27,000 messages, and having the business processes to disseminate it with the right team. Keep in mind, this is overseas, different time zones, and the culture of appreciation to persist and say, I think this is real. Something in social media is indicating a real problem. In the second example, I think it's a little bit more of a common environment. As I mentioned before, it's sort of a social media marketer who's really evangelical about creating a social business. So this is a wireless company where they were monitoring on a weekly basis, usually for new launches of handsets, Marcom, and a little bit of customer service. And this was a case where they were not doing the monitoring by themselves, but instead having a reporting-like service provide these weekly reports. And what they were accustomed to seeing was a lot of positive sentiment. This is a unique wireless company that gets a lot of brand favorability and positive sentiment in social media, something that, as many of you know, if you cover wireless at all, you don't see. And as people, as consumers know, we love to complain about our wireless companies. So in this case, the team receives a weekly report and they say, what's going on here? We usually don't see this increase in negativity. Based on the launch of a new handset, our customers are usually so excited about getting the new release. What was happening here is that there was a device issue. There was something wrong with it. It wasn't working in the right way. And so the social media team took it to the engineers and they said, there's absolutely no problem here. We're not seeing these complaints coming through our call center. We didn't test this in early tests, that we didn't see these results. So I don't think you know what you're talking about, AKA we have no respect for marketing. And marketing went back and they said, no, we see this here. And so they went in by themselves and they started looking at the data. They ended up going to other different functions in the organization. Is anybody seeing this? And finally, they were able to, over time, see that it was coming up through the more normal channels. And they got a little bit of validation. So they went back to the engineers and they said, look, now we've got the data from social, we've got the data through our normal channels. It hadn't yet gotten to the point where they were seeing in-store maintenance reports or people getting refunds, but it was just on the precipice. And they were able to take that early data and go back and say, can you please make this change? We're starting to aggregate a little bit of information here. And it was because of her persistence and her belief that social matters that eventually they did make the change. So it saved the company a little bit of money, but really it took a lot of going against the forces in the business to say, this matters, trust me, this is real, this isn't just a bunch of people talking about their lunch on Twitter. And we hear that a lot. But sometimes this explains behavior. And this is another quote from a client of mine at a B2C financial product company. When I asked her for an example, she says, well, it's a little bit more complicated because usually we won't make a business decision based on one source of data, as we just saw in the previous example. If a thing is true, it will show up everywhere. There are for sure times when we have negative sentiment on a topic and we don't change what we're doing. So it's complicated. Sometimes we do change, sometimes we don't. And this is where I started to think, well, why would you change? We'll talk later about how fickle customers can be and how reluctant a business could be to make a decision based on what customers are saying, regardless of the amount of control they have. But what would be the most compelling case to say you should act on sentiment? And I come back to this idea of if it was predictive of behaviors. So I turned to the academic literature and started to think about what do we know about behavior? Are there studies that show the relationship between positive and negative affect, as they say in academia, and behaviors, good behavioral outcome measures? And it's peppered with a little bit of work, and it's an increasing body of work, as many of you know. Emotion words are thought of as very important cues, but typically in the academic literature, they're looked at in relation to other emotions, cognitive states, moods, motivations, intentions, but not really behaviors and not really purchase behaviors. So recently a study came out that got a lot of press and subsequently a lot of criticism and is still really being looked at closely, showing that Facebook likes predict market movement. So on a daily basis, somebody tracked the likes of the top 30 brands on Facebook and looked at it in relationship to the daily stock price. And he found that it covers an enormous proportion of the variance, 99.5%. So it was an unprecedented correlation here, almost so high that it became suspect. But still, people are starting to see that maybe there is a relationship, and I look forward to the Thomson Reuters presentation later today, who've been looking into a lot of this data and have a lot of compelling cases. There was another interesting study that at first glance seems unrelated, but does have some really nice behavioral outcomes and was published in Science. So we see here that sentiment on Twitter across 82 different cultures is correlated with circadian rhythms and the known effect of sleep. So it's sort of an interesting study, and I'll just quickly show you the graph here because I think it's just so fascinating that across all of these different cultures, we have this reliable pattern of our mood as evidenced through Twitter, and this is done using linguistic inquiry and word count, or LIWC, a very simple word-based text analysis program that's just counting the numbers of positive and negative emotion words and looking at them over time. And what you see is that on every day of the week, we're looking at positive affect on the top and negative affect on the bottom. We see this very reliable pattern where we peak upon waking, and then we sort of dip as we go to work, and then it peaks again in the evening. The only difference that you see with Saturday and Sunday, the colors in gray and the lightest gold, is that there's a slight shift. So that positive peak happens about 2 hours later because we wake up a little bit later. So this is very compelling evidence that sentiment is a real thing and it's tied to real behaviors, but it gets us only part of the way there. In the last study, one that I think is really great and relevant, even though it's in the relationships literature, because I think about our relationships and consumers' relationships with brands quite a bit. Through instant messages, again using linguistic inquiry and word count, Rich Slatcher and colleagues were able to show that positive emotion words predict couples staying together. Separately, negative emotion words predict breakups. But then in another study, where he was using a naturalistic language recorder, capturing little snippets of couples' language throughout the day, he showed no relationship between positive emotion and couples staying together. So on the one hand, in certain situations, we do have a body of compelling evidence. In other situations, we don't really see a relationship, or we see a suspect correlation. So what do we know so far? I think we know a lot of the unknowns. So one of the questions that looms large in my head is the expression of sentiment the same thing as the experience of it? That's something that's important for us to know if we're going to base business decisions on the behaviors as manifested by sentiment. Next, and you'll note that I left off here, is sentiment a reliable methodology, because I'm trying to move us away from that idea. That sentiment predicts actual buying behavior. I'm really passionate about this idea, and I think it's a huge body of research that we should all dedicate ourselves to. Next, and a common complaint that I hear all the time is, who is this sample? Is this sample a reliable set of people of interest? Are they buyers? What is their history like? Are they potentials? Are these people who have shopped with us before? Are these people who are really going to be committed to buying a new car? So who are these people, and what can we know about them to help us make meaning and contextualize the sentiment that they are expressing and or experiencing? Lastly, some of the things that came up in the examples where I talked about the importance of environment, so that executives believe in sentiment and social media more generally. I talked a little bit about how sentiment can be a gateway drug, if you will, to more social signals at large. But I think it's really important for the culture of a business and the executives on whose dashboard sentiment is apparent, for them to believe in it and to pay such close attention that they're basically immersed in the data, and so they know when to act and when not to act. And then lastly, what is the relationship between sentiment and other channels of data? Although we see a lot of companies who require things like call center volume to be in parallel with sentiment or even buzz volume, what should the relationship be? Should social be a leading indicator, or should social come up at the same time as some of these other channels? So what is the right periodicity or cadence with which we should look at sentiment in comparison to other metrics? I think these areas are huge ones to focus on and important bodies of research for the upcoming year if we, and I think we all do, want sentiment to be taken seriously and want business decisions to be based on it. So where do we go from here? The next chapter of this story, I think on the academic side, there's a lot of work to be done about what is the relationship between affect or sentiment and what it predicts. So how much variance of these complex behaviors does it really account for? It's important, though, for academics to have access to some of these social media samples and the buying-related data that's not always publicly available. So starting to forge some of these partnerships. On the business side, I think what we need is a de-hyping. So when I called all of my clients and they were so excited to talk about this, but then reticent to give examples and then really eager to talk about how they really couldn't do it, but they wanted to, I think that people are really reluctant to throw social under the bus. Everybody wants to be known for their groundbreaking, best-in-class work in social, but typically they're using social as a confirmatory variable. So we need to give them the confidence to be able to talk about sentiment in a way that's meaningful. Again, having tied it to behaviors so that they can feel comfortable using social as a business decision factor. And then lastly, I just want to remind everybody that of course it's tricky. Of course we shouldn't be looking for this beautiful relationship because nothing is so simple. Business decisions are really tricky. The environment always plays a big role. Ego always plays a big role. Data plays a huge role. So regardless of the extent to which consumers are in control, sometimes we can't expect a business to change what it's doing based on what consumers are saying, regardless of the hype about the control that we have now. So here's a famous quote by Steve Jobs where he says, "It's really hard to design products based on focus groups. A lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them." So maybe we're waiting for something that people aren't talking about. Maybe we're looking for their reactions more than what they're predicting. So a few things that we can do in the meantime. I think we can ensure that the methodology is transparent and just assuage some of those concerns about the accuracy or the precision and arm people with the tools to talk about why it's okay, why this is a reliable methodology, or why it's not that great, but it's all that you really need right now, and not really allow them to say, well, I prefer when it's NLP-based or it's entity-based, because I don't think that people are empowered to have that discussion. I think it's just an easy out. Explore sample characteristics through entity extraction. This would be great. So look into buying history and purchase intent. Use some of the sophisticated natural language processing that you have access to look at the relationship between these behaviors that matter and the sentiment. Substantiate the sentiment metric. So validate it in some way, contextualize it, add attributes to it. I hesitate to even bring up the word influence this late in the talk, but think about how you could substantiate the sentiment metric or standardize it so that we can talk about it across different data sets. And lastly, link sentiment and behavior. And this is a real call to arms to partner with academics to build up a data set here. So on the penultimate page, as we conclude this talk, let's move away from calibration and focus on the relationship to behaviors. I've made this point several times now. I hope you understand. Incremental improvements in accuracy are not going to play a role in making business decisions happen based on sentiment. Academia is a great place to partner, and vice versa. Lastly, sentiment is contagious and full of trickery. It's always going to be important to be immersed in the data. Encourage this behavior with your platforms. Make it simple to get involved. Make it easy for people to start reading the different signals that are there and painting a picture where they can interpret what's going on with sentiment in accordance with other metrics, whether they be from channel in social or external. And then promote this idea as DNA. Let's get the idea out there. Generate case studies on how it's always a combination. We don't have to paint such a simple picture. We can talk about the truth and how sentiment is tied to topics or a driver's analysis or a segment analysis and how it all fits together in the context of a business environment so that businesses can afford the infrastructure to make sentiment-based decisions and have the processes and culture that they need. Thank you so much. I'm open to any questions. I do feel as though I'm immersed in the data, so ask me any questions that are empirically driven.
Thank you. Kate, hi. It's a great talk, and I really appreciate your thoughts on whether sentiment can actually be used for business decisions or not. My question is more about the two examples you used were sort of examples where people had spent already a lot of mind cycles and time and had built products and were very invested in those products. So I think the level that sentiment had to play to overturn those thoughts, the bar would be really, really high. Mm-hmm. But yet you had a quote at the end from Steve Jobs that you can't use sentiment for actual product design because you can't build products by sort of group consensus. I'm wondering, what are your feelings about using sentiment much earlier in the process, like around product design, and when people are much more open to listen to what other opinions might be there before they've invested so much time? Is that more fruitful, or do you think it falls into the same issues?
So it's a great question. If I've heard correctly, it's what are my feelings about using sentiment early in the process as opposed to later upon launch of a product, given what we see in most product-oriented companies with the investment in releases being so high. I would have to say that I'm more of a researcher than a business person, so I believe devotedly in doing a lot of research throughout, especially early on, not at the cost of a business decision. So I think that sentiment can prove useful if we have a lot of those assumptions accounted for. I'm tempted to go back to the slide about the unknown knowns, or the known unknowns rather. I think that if we know that this is a sample of potential buyers, actual buyers, buyers with a previous history, and we can find that through some entity extraction to say these people are worth paying attention to, then it's a really great early indicator. In my early career, I worked at BuzzMetrics prior to the Nielsen acquisition and worked with a lot of clients who used buzz data in general as an early indicator of weak signals that would eventually become stronger over time. And I think we did have a lot of evidence that it can be the case. But in the same way that a great product takes a lot of investment, great research takes a lot of investment. And so it's not so simple as getting the sentiment data early on, but having somebody who's really immersed in it and knowing when to pay attention to it, when to act on it, when to take it seriously. Sort of like we saw in that second case study with that persistence. She knew that it mattered. And I think rarely do you have somebody who's not in the data who can really tell you, this is important. Again, it's hard to have somebody at the analyst level who understands all the factors that inform a business decision. So it can be really tricky. I think it takes a partnership there, but I do believe that it can be a great leading indicator. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you know whether sentiment means something different about a product versus a service. You brought up product examples, but people experience services in a different way, maybe a more personal way. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference? Do you know there's a difference, or is it something that needs to be studied?
I think it's a fantastic question. What is the difference in sentiment for a product as compared to a service? I think that people's language and the dynamic when talking about different, let's just call them artifacts, whether they're products or services, varies greatly. I don't have any data to suggest it's a more intimate conversation or a more immediate conversation, but I would hypothesize that that is the case. Again, I feel so cliche, but it's an argument for data immersion, and that's why it's so great to have these on-site analysts with the horizontal expertise of what social means, but then the vertical functionality to know how do people normally talk about our product or service, and what should we expect, and is this an intimate conversation and one that we should really act on, or is this just par for the course? Thank you.